investigation, and it was one of those topics that's bubbling under. I've got dozens and dozens of things I want to talk about, but I'm trying to not make the financial segments too painfully long for the listeners. But they said that their Edward Jones person claimed to be a fiduciary, which I thought was odd. I don't know that that's not true, but historically my experience with Edward Jones and people that have Edward Jones as their managers, air quotes again, that has not been what I've seen. So maybe Edward Jones is now making the shift, but Edward Jones has some conflicts, I think, and I'm going to go through some of those. But I'm going to talk about things that are in the article, and they include quotes from the author of the article and quotes from the people that the author interviewed. The author interviewed at least 5 former employees of Edward Jones, and so they might be biased or, bitter because they've left the company. So, keep that in mind. But go read the story yourself. I think it's a fun and enjoyable story. They were talking about this person named Anderson, and he wanted to ask people at Edward Jones if they're going to follow the new fiduciary rules that might be coming out. And this was before they were actually finalized. And one of the comments he got from upper management is that we're not going to go there until we're forced to. So that's kind of the attitude that they have a way of doing things, and it makes them a lot of money. And if that's not necessarily in the best interest of the client, so be it. Their job is not to be in the best interest of the client. Their job is to make money, which is a standard thing that corporations are supposed to do. That's why I'm sorry, libertarian friends, but that's why I like some government regulation, because companies will tend to make money even if it's at the cost of other people's well-being. And this is one of those cases where they do it and they comply only as they have to with the law, and the idea that everyone will know that they're not providing good advice and not use them is a fallacy, because people use Edward Jones all of the time. Also had a quote here, and I'm going to read this from you. This is just a quote from the article. Quote, "As the law now stands, advisors who help millions of Americans save for retirement are under no obligation to work in their clients' best interest. Unbeknownst to many savers, advisors are incentivized with bonuses and perks like free vacations to recommend products based on commissions they bring, rather than whether a product is best for the client." End quote. So that's kind of what I've been explaining to you, that they have a suitability standard which is close to meaningless, and they are not under obligation to do what is best for you. And that's system-wide. That's not just Edward Jones. That's the vast majority. I would say 90 to 95% of all advisors are under that situation. They also had another former advisor that they just called the Ohio advisor. It said he left to become an independent fiduciary, and he said, quote, "At the end of my years there, I saw pretty questionable results for clients," end quote. I've also seen that many times where people come to me with mutual funds that don't seem to make sense, and you have to wonder, why did they pick those funds? And it's funny because the article covers this, and I'm going to quote from the article here again. Quote, "It begins with what clients get to see. Advisors typically start with the preferred fund families, a menu of products that are most commonly shown and sold to the clients," end quote. So you are only shown a certain amount of stuff. So when someone works at Edward Jones, they're only paid as the advisor, generally, unless they've made some changes that I'm not aware of, but this is what this article is talking about. They're paid to sell you certain things. They're not paid to know things. They're paid to sell things. That is their job. And it's not necessarily bad, but the problem comes is when you don't know that. And then I'm going to go back to the story here. Quote, "Fund companies pay for the privilege. What's on the menu are only firms that are paying revenue-sharing agreements," said Bullard, the law professor. And this is, like I said, this is just yanked out of the story here. I continue on with the quote. "Jones received a combined $184 million in revenue-sharing payments in 2015, a fifth of its net income for the year. One company, American Funds, paid nearly $50 million, end quote. So American Funds paid Edward Jones $50 million so that Edward Jones employees will tell you how great American Funds are. the ironic thing is American funds aren't even the worst funds out there, but they are paying a lot of money to the advisors to tell you that you should get those funds. I see that as a conflict. If the advisor does their research and finds American funds are the best, that's fine. They can recommend them, and then you should pay them for that research and that effort. But that's not how it works. You may pay a fee. You may not pay a fee, and they may just get a commission, or you can pay both. That's a new thing that I've seen more and more commonly, is that people will come to me and they say they have a fee-based advisor. Fee-based is not fee only. You want an advisor that is fee only. You pay them, and they get paid no other way. Often companies will sell A-share funds that have 5.75% commission, 6% commission, up to 8.5% is the limit by law. So it's very interesting, and most people don't know that advisors get kickbacks. And matter of fact, again, I'm going to read a little bit from the article here. Quote, in 2004, Jones, meaning Edward Jones, had to pay $75 million and disclose its revenue-sharing agreements with third parties after the Securities and Exchange Commission found that Jones told investors its preferred funds were chosen for the performance and objectives, failing to note the seven-figure kickbacks, end quote. So, common situation here. Edward Jones, back in 2004, was, I guess, I don't know if I want to say found guilty. The ruling was made by the Securities and Exchange Commission that they were not being forthright and they were misleading investors. So they had to pay a $75 million penalty, which, if you remember back from just a minute ago, they're getting $184 million in just 2015 from the revenue sharing programs. So they take all this money, they misled investors, and they had to give up, slightly more than a third of the revenue from 1 year as a penalty for doing it. And what a lot of these companies do is they get busted not because they're taking these revenue sharing agreements, because they're not being clear with you. So what they do is they change the language so it sounds like they're telling you, or they make sure that there's something in the prospectus, in the documents that you get, that show you that they're getting these revenue sharing agreements. And as long as you're handed that and sign off on that, it's really, really clear that they've told you. And so now they can keep collecting this money, and they won't get fined for not disclosing it because they actually did tell you. So that's their solution. The solution was not to discontinue the potentially deceptive practice, but to make sure that they tell you that they're getting paid to sell you something. And you may or may not read that. The article goes on a lot about how advisors are not educated in how investments work. They're not going through classes to learn about risk and reward trade-offs, but they constantly go into classes that teach them how to sell, how to call people, how to hustle people, and which things to promote, which things to push. And, we talk about, or at least I have on the show before, about vacations and stuff that they get. And the article also goes into the vacations. And one of the advisors said that you find yourself at the end of a quarter when the time frame ends for the vacation bonus, and it can be tied to almost anything. And the example they gave is there's a certain bond. They were trying to sell enough of this bond fund. And so they call up every one of their clients, one after another, and say, you need this bond fund. You need this bond fund. And if they can get enough of their clients to switch from whatever bond fund they had to another bond fund, without sometimes regard to if it's a good bond fund, if it's a better bond fund, and not even necessarily taking into account tax consequences you may have in a taxable account moving from one bond fund to another, the motivation for the employee is simply to tie up that vacation. If they can sell enough dollars of a specific thing, they get a all expense paid vacation for themselves and their spouse. That's what they're doing it for. That's how it works. So one of the advisors that had left said, quote, there were days when I couldn't tell you whether what I did was for more right for the client or myself, end quote. And so that's the problem, is that the system is designed in such a way that you may not necessarily be doing what's in the client's best interest. So Anyway, enough on that. You can go check that out at International Business Times, a nice and lengthy article with lots of information in it. I think you'll enjoy it. So what I'm going to do now is go into our little commercial break, and we'll come back with an interview with Casper Rigsby. He has many, many books out about religion, atheism, and why it's all a bunch of crap, and I think you'll enjoy that. So hang on, and after the commercial, we'll go right into that.
Here's an excerpt from Our Constitution, The Way It Was by Dr. Madeleine O'Hare.
Seemingly, no one knew just what to do. There was no clear-cut program. Some wanted to try to continue to negotiate with the British government. Others wanted to continue the armed revolt in the hopes of forcing the king and parliament to remedy their grievances. There was no one, apparently, who had the vision to call for complete severance of all political ties with Britain and to found a new nation. The situation remained stalemated until the end of the year. Then, in January 1775, Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, came off the press. It was like a fresh wind clearing away a fog. In the simple yet forceful language that characterizes all his writings, Paine showed the absurdity of continuing a relationship of colonies to a mother country. Why, he asked, should the colonies, already peopled with 3 million inhabitants and destined to expand to cover a vast continent, be ruled from a small island 3,000 miles away? Why continue to be subjects of a tyrant king when the way was open to be citizens of a free republic? This pamphlet spread like wildfire. The small presses of the time could not keep up with the demand. Hundreds of thousands of copies were issued and penetrated to every colony in a short time. Paine's arguments were unanswerable. They left no middle ground. All talk of compromise and further petitions to Parliament died out. The debate was carried into the Continental Congress, and in a couple of months, a committee was appointed to draw up a formal statement. Thomas Jefferson was selected by the committee to make the draft. 6 months, almost to the day, after Paine's Common Sense appeared, Congress issued that famous document, which we call the Declaration of Independence. It has often been claimed that Paine actually composed and wrote the Declaration. This is debatable, and there seems to be no strong evidence to that effect, but that he was the man, more so than any other, who caused it to be written, no one can deny. All of the leaders of the Revolution gave him full credit for solidifying the sentiment for independence. Washington, converted by Common Sense, wrote asserting that Paine's words were, quote, sound doctrine and unanswerable reasoning. Jefferson, John Adams, Franklin, and Madison all wrote praising Paine's flaming arguments. In later years, Thomas Jefferson said of Paine, quote, no writer has exceeded Paine in ease and familiarity of style, perspicuity of expression, happiness of elucidation, and in simple and unassuming language, end quote. Franklin said, I value myself on the share I had in procuring for America the acquisition of so useful and valuable a citizen as Thomas Paine. John Adams wrote, history will ascribe the Revolution to Thomas Paine.
Our Constitution, The Way It Was by Dr. Madeleine O'Hare is now available at atheistaudiobooks.com.
Only on Secular Media Network.
All right, everybody, this is Phil Ferguson. Welcome back, and we now have on the phone, on the computer, Casper Rigsby. He is a well-known blogger at Atheist Republic and apparently a fantastically prolific author. Casper, how you doing?
I'm doing really, really well, really well. I just got out of the hospital recently, so I wasn't doing that good for a while, but I'm doing great now.
Oh, well, if you don't mind me asking, what happened? And you're all better, you said?
Yeah. I had a bout of congestive heart failure and pneumonia. And then my kidneys tried to shut down on me, so my body just hates me.
A bout of congestive heart failure. Well, that's quite a bout you had.
Yeah, it's unfortunately something that I just have to deal with. I've had congenital heart disease since I was born, so sometimes my heart just gets angry. And
Wow.